Picture the old way. It is the 1800s, and the country has just held a presidential election in early November. The people vote, and then for 4 months, almost nothing happens. The winner does not take office until the 4th of March. In between, the person the country just voted out, the loser, the rejected president, keeps every power of the office all winter long. And the Congress the country just voted out keeps legislating too, in what was called the short session, sitting from December until March. Defeated lawmakers, already told by the voters to go home, still passing laws on their way out the door. We had a name for those people: lame ducks. For most of American history, that 4 month gap was just an inconvenience, a slow, gentlemanly handoff in an age of horses and telegraphs. And then twice the gap turned dangerous. The winter of 1860 into 1861, Abraham Lincoln had been elected in November, but he could not take office until March, and across those 4 months, 7 states seceded while the outgoing president, James Buchanan, insisted he could do little to stop them. The Union came apart during the waiting period, and again in the winter of 1932 into 33. Franklin Roosevelt had beaten Herbert Hoover in a landslide in the depths of the Great Depression, and the country had to wait from November all the way to March 4th, while banks failed by the thousands, and the outgoing administration and the incoming one, who did not trust each other, could not or would not act together. The gap was not just awkward anymore, it was a hole in the floor, in the middle of a crisis. The fix was the 20th Amendment, ratified in 1933, and championed by Senator George Norris of Nebraska so relentlessly that people just called it the lame duck amendment. And here's the question for this primer. The 20th Amendment moved the start dates for a new president and a new Congress, and in doing so it closed the lame duck gap cleanly. But along the way it also wrote a set of rules about what happens if a president-elect dies, or is never chosen, or fails to qualify before taking office. So the question is this: in fixing the calendar, what succession scenarios did it quietly leave unanswered? This is Do It for the Case Law, Doctrine Deep Dive, Season 0, the amendments, one at a time, one sharpest gap each. Today, the 20th. One thing to say at the top because it shapes everything that follows. This episode has almost no case law in it, and that is not a gap in our research, it is the finding. We went looking hard for judicial decisions interpreting the operative clauses of this amendment, the succession provisions in particular. There essentially are none. What exists instead is a different kind of authority, opinions from the executive branch's own lawyers, the practice Congress has followed when it drafts and ratifies amendments, and a body of scholarship. Useful, all of it, and none of it binding the way a Supreme Court holding binds. So when we say a question here is unresolved, we mean something stronger than usual. We mean no court has ever had to answer it. The 20th Amendment does two jobs, and it helps to keep them separate in your head. Job 1 is the calendar. Section 1 says the terms of the president and vice president end at noon on the 20th day of January, and the terms of senators and representatives end at noon on the 3rd day of January, and the terms of their successors begin at that same moment. Section 2 says the Congress shall assemble at least once every year, and that meeting shall begin at noon on the 3rd day of January, unless they by law pick a different day. That is the whole engine of the reform. It pulled the presidential handoff back from March 4th to January 20th, shrinking the gap from about 4 months to about 11 weeks. And it ended the lame duck short session by having each new Congress convene in early January rather than letting the old, defeated one legislate through the winter. The first president sworn in under the new calendar was Roosevelt himself at his second inauguration on January 20th, 1937. His first inauguration, back in 33, had been the very last of the old March 4th ceremonies. Job 2 is the fine print of the handoff. Once you tighten the schedule like that, you have to ask a set of uncomfortable what-if questions about the moment of transfer, and Section 3 is the amendment trying to answer them. What if, when the clock strikes noon on January 20th, there is no president ready to step into the office? Section 3 writes down some answers, and Section 4 adds one more narrow power about what happens if a candidate dies during the unusual situation where the House or the Senate has to pick the winner. There are two more sections most people never read, and they are worth 30 seconds because they show the amendment doing something structural that has nothing to do with succession. Section 5 says Sections 1 and 2 take effect on the 15th day of October following ratification. Section 6 says the amendment is inoperative unless it is ratified within 7 years of being submitted to the states. That second one is the interesting one, a deadline on ratification itself. Congress had begun attaching time limits to proposed amendments, and where exactly to put that limit in the text of the amendment or in the resolution proposing it became a genuine drafting question that Congress worked through case by case. The 20th carries its deadline inside the amendment. Later amendments have handled it differently. It is a small thing, and it is the kind of small thing that decides whether a proposed amendment is alive or dead decades later. Start with the good news, because it is real. The date change part is clean. It did exactly what it promised, nobody litigates it, and there is essentially no case law fighting over it because there is nothing to fight about. Noon on January 20th is noon on January 20th. If the whole amendment were Sections 1 and 2, This would be a very short episode about a reform that simply worked. It is worth pausing on that because we spend most of this show finding the places where constitutional machinery fails. Sometimes it just works, and the people who built it deserve to be told so. It is also worth being honest about what the fix did not fix. 11 weeks is much better than 4 months. It is still 11 weeks. A modern presidential transition is an enormous undertaking. Thousands of appointments, agency handoffs, national security briefings, and it is compressed into that window while the outgoing administration still holds every power of the office. The lame duck period did not disappear in 1933. It got shorter, and the amendment does nothing at all about what an outgoing president may do during it. The powers are undiminished until the clock strikes noon. Whatever restraint operates in those weeks is political and customary, not constitutional. The 20th shortened the runway. It did not put a governor on the engine. The interesting part is Section 3, and it rewards reading slowly because the drafters were trying to cover several different failure scenarios in one dense paragraph. Take them one at a time. First sentence, if at the time fixed for the beginning of the term the president-elect has died, the vice president-elect shall become president. Clean and strong, the president-elect dies before inauguration, the vice president-elect moves up and becomes president. Not acting president, but president, full stop. Second scenario, if a president has not been chosen before the time fixed for the beginning of the term, or if the president-elect has failed to qualify, then the vice president-elect shall act as president until a president has qualified. Notice the shift. Here the vice president-elect does not become president, he or she acts as president, as a placeholder until the real one is sorted out. And then a backstop, the Congress may by law provide for the case where neither a president-elect nor a vice president-elect has qualified, naming who shall then act. That backstop is where the Presidential Succession Act plugs in, the law that puts the Speaker of the House next in line, and after the Speaker, the President pro tempore of the Senate, and then the Cabinet in order. Section 4 adds one more permission. For a genuinely strange corner. Under the 12th Amendment, if no candidate wins a majority in the Electoral College, the choice of president goes to the House of Representatives voting among the top finishers, and the choice of vice president goes to the Senate. Section 4 says, if one of those candidates dies while the House or the Senate is in the middle of deciding, the Congress may by law provide a rule for it. It is a contingency on top of a contingency. So on the surface, the 20th Amendment looks fairly complete. Death of the president-elect, covered. No president chosen in time, covered. President-elect who fails to qualify, covered. Both top slots empty. Congress can fill in by statute. A candidate dying during a contingent election in Congress may provide. That is a remarkable number of contingencies to pack into one short amendment, and it is easy to come away thinking the drafters thought of everything. But hold on to two things as we go. First, the phrase that does the most work in all of Section 3, President-elect, is never once defined. And second, the most important sounding provisions are not commands at all. They are permissions. The Congress may, by law, provide. May. Keep both of those in mind. Here is where the quiet problems live, and this episode has a different shape than most of ours. Usually we find a grand constitutional promise that the courts then narrow with doctrine, and the distance between the words and the enforcement is the story. The 20th Amendment is not like that. These are pipes that have simply never been pressure tested, because the exact emergencies they describe have never quite happened. Let me give you the three sharpest, and then a fourth that ties them together. The first one, who? Exactly. Is the president-elect? The entire succession scheme in Section 3 is built on that phrase, and the amendment never tells you when a human being becomes the president-elect. Is it the night the television networks call the race in early November? Is it when the voters have voted? Is it when the electors cast their electoral votes in mid-December? Is it only when Congress counts those votes in early January? It matters enormously, and here is why. Section 3's cleanest, strongest rule, president-elect dies and the vice president-elect becomes president, only functions if there is a president-elect for the death to happen to. Sit with the mechanics of that moment for a second because the amendment is unusually precise about it and the precision is the point. At noon on January 20th, one term ends and another begins in the same instant. There is no gap, not a second of one. The Constitution does not contemplate a moment when nobody holds the office. That is why Section 3 has to work so hard. If the person meant to fill that instant is not available, something has to fill it anyway, immediately, because the alternative is an office that is legally vacant. So these are not academic puzzles about paperwork, they are about a specific instant on a specific day when, constitutionally, somebody must be president. And for several plausible scenarios, the text does not clearly say who. So suppose the winning candidate dies in late November, after the popular vote but before the electors meet. Is there a president-elect yet? A strong argument says no. The electors have not voted, and under the Constitution they are the ones who actually choose the president. If there is no president-elect yet, then Section 3's tidy rule simply does not fire, and the country is left with a set of electors pledged to a person who can no longer be elected, and no clear constitutional instruction telling those electors what to do next. The word the whole section leans on has no fixed moment attached to it, and this is not purely hypothetical. The country has already brushed against it once before the 20th Amendment even existed. In 1872, Horace Greeley ran against Ulysses Grant, lost badly, and then died on the 29th of November after the popular vote but before the Electoral College met in December. The electors who had been pledged to Greeley scattered their votes among several other men, and Congress ended up declining to count the handful of electoral votes that were still cast for a dead candidate. It caused no crisis, precisely because Greeley was the loser. His death changed nothing about who became president, but run the same timing for the winner and you have run straight into the undefined edge of Section 3, a candidate gone in that no man's land between the people's vote and the elector's vote, with the phrase president-elect not yet clearly attaching to anyone. The second problem, the text covers death, but it is silent on incapacity. Look again at Section 3's triggers. The president-elect who has died, who has failed to qualify, or who was never chosen. There is no word there for a president-elect who is alive, who was unmistakably chosen, but who is incapacitated. In a coma, say, after an accident on the 18th of January, 2 days before the term begins. Failed to qualify is naturally read to mean failing to meet the qualifications for office, age, citizenship, the formal oath and steps, not falling gravely ill. And the amendment we all instinctively reach for on presidential disability, the 25th, only switches on for a president who is already in office, someone who has already taken the oath. A president-elect at 11:59 on the morning of January 20th has not taken that oath yet. So an incapacitated president-elect falls into the crack between the 20th Amendment, which talks about death but not disability, and the 25th, which talks about disability but only after the oath. Neither one clearly reaches the person lying in that hospital bed. And remember what we said at the top. There is no court decision to consult on this. Not a narrow one, not an unhelpful one, none. The third problem is that permissive word may. Twice, at the end of Section 3 and across the whole of Section 4, the amendment declines to decide anything itself. It hands the decision to Congress that Congress may, by law, provide. Now, to its credit, Congress did act on part of this, which is why we can confidently say the Speaker of the House is next in line if both the President-elect and Vice President-elect slots come up empty. But a permission is not a guarantee. Wherever Congress has not legislated in detail, and the Section 4 scenario is the cleanest example of a place it largely has not, the Constitution's actual answer is something close to someone really ought to write a rule for that. And until someone does, there is no rule. It is worth saying that the statute Congress did write has its own long-running controversy. Putting the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate ahead of the Cabinet has been criticized for decades on the ground that those officers are legislators rather than executive officers, and that elevating them may sit awkwardly with the Constitution's description of who may act as president. That argument has never been resolved either for the same reason as everything else in this episode. The scenario that would force a court to decide it has never occurred. So the backstop the amendment points to is itself resting on a question mark, and the question mark has been there since 1947. And here is the fourth edge, the one that braids the others together, the contested count. Section 3 says that if a president has not been chosen by the deadline, the vice president-elect acts as president in the meantime. But who decides whether a president has been chosen when the count itself is what people are fighting about? The amendment offers a placeholder. The vice president-elect holds the office temporarily, but it does not resolve the underlying dispute. And it does not say how long temporarily is allowed to last. The machinery for actually counting the electoral votes lives in separate law, and the seam between that counting machinery and the 20th Amendment's not chosen trigger has never been tested by a real contested case. There is one more thing the amendment does not address, and it is arguably the largest of all. What if the dispute is not about a candidate but about the count, and it is still unresolved when noon arrives on January 20th? Section 3 has an answer of a sort. If no president has been chosen, the vice president-elect acts. But that presumes we know who the vice president-elect is, which presumes the same contested count produced a clear answer for the second slot while failing to produce one for the first. That can happen. It is not obvious it usually would. And if neither has been settled, the statute takes over and the Speaker of the House acts as president, which means the resolution of a disputed presidential election could pass to an officer chosen by one chamber of Congress under a statute whose own constitutionality has been argued about for 80 years. Congress has in fact revisited that counting machinery recently, rewriting the statute that governs how electoral votes are counted, clarifying the vice president's role as ministerial, and raising the threshold for lodging objections. That is a meaningful repair, and it addresses real weaknesses that had been visible for a long time. But notice what it does and does not do. It tightens the counting process. It does not define president-elect, it does not reach an incapacitated one, and it does not tell you what happens if the process runs past the deadline anyway. The statute made the machine more reliable. The constitutional seam it feeds into is exactly where it was. So here is the thesis, and it is a different shape than usual for this show. Most of our episodes hunt for the distance between what an amendment promises and what a court will actually enforce. The 20th does not work that way. It is mostly plumbing, and the plumbing mostly works. The calendar fix was a genuine, unglamorous success, and it deserves the credit. The distance here is not between promise and enforcement, it is between the scenarios the drafters in 1933 thought to imagine and the ones the country might one day actually face. A candidate who dies at exactly the wrong point on the timeline, a president-elect who is alive but cannot serve, a count that nobody agrees on, a contingency Congress was permitted to legislate for but never did. The amendment answers, and answers well, the questions it thought to ask. Its quiet problems are the questions it did not think to ask at all. And there is a second lesson sitting underneath the first about what it means for a constitutional question to be open. We are used to open meaning contested. 2 lines of cases, a circuit split, briefs on both sides. That is not the situation here. These questions are open in a rarer and more uncomfortable sense, untouched. No litigant has ever been in a position to raise them, so no court has ever had to think about them, so there is no doctrine at all, only text and argument. Which means if one of these scenarios ever does arrive, it will arrive as an emergency, on a deadline measured in days, with the answer being worked out for the first time by people under enormous pressure. That is not a comfortable way to discover what your Constitution means. Before the close, one honest caveat about this whole episode. We have been describing problems, and it would be easy to hear that as prediction. It is not. Every scenario in this episode is unlikely in any given cycle, and the country has run more than 20 presidential transitions under this amendment without hitting any of them. That record is real evidence that the machinery is basically sound. The argument is narrower. It is that low-probability events are exactly the ones a constitution exists to handle because they are the ones politics handles worst. A rule you never need is cheap. A rule you need once, in an emergency, and discover you never wrote, is the most expensive thing in government. The 20th Amendment wrote most of those rules. This episode is about the handful it left blank. And that is the sample. A full Amendment 20 season on this show would take each of these seams in turn, the calendar fix and the 2 crises that forced it, the pre-inauguration succession rules of Section 3 walked through one scenario at a time, the odd contingent election corner of Section 4, the Presidential Succession Act, and the long argument about who belongs in the line, and the untested edges where the text simply runs out. 1 question per episode, each grounded in the constitutional text and the historical record, not in memory. A word on how this show works. Everything you just heard is legal and historical education, not legal advice. We are walking through how the Constitution's machinery is built and where its joints are weak, not telling you what to do in any real situation. And because this one is structural, there were no court holdings to quote, and we checked that rather than assuming it. The substance is the text of the 20th Amendment itself and the documented history around it, the old March 4th inaugurations, the Lincoln and Roosevelt transitions, the 1933 ratification, the first January 20th swearing in 37, and the Greeley episode of 1872. Every piece of it checked against the record, not recalled from memory. That is the whole ethos, and it is the name of the show. Do it for the case law. I'll see you at the next amendment.